Microplastics are everywhere and have been found in our body tissue, bloodstreams, and even in our brain. People are gradually realizing how harmful they are, but many people who are aware of microplastics still aren't fully persuaded and aren't adjusting their lifestyles accordingly. Why is this so? Well, it's probably a mix of cultural convenience, but also a general lack of understanding and awareness. And so in this video, I'm going to run you through a few data points that I found from my research. But we all know that us humans are often not very logical people. So what will it take to fully persuade us to build that deep conviction that we should take microplastics seriously? In the later part of this video, I'll walk you through an imaginative exercise to imagine what a microplastic-free world could look like, and hopefully to motivate and inspire us to treat it a little more seriously. But first, let's get to the data. Now, there are many articles that have touched on this topic, but the research is still relatively early stage and the conclusions are patchy and tentative. One paper I've read suggested that microplastics are suspected to harm human reproductive, digestive, and respiratory health, with a suggested link to colon and lung cancer. Another article says that microplastics have been found in human tissues and may lead to gene expression changes, oxidative stress, and inflammatory pathways associated with chronic disease. Another review examined biopsies from the patients who had suffered colorectal cancer and passed away. And in this study, they found that the blood tissues of these cancer patients contained relatively higher levels of microplastic infiltration, higher than those seen in non-cancerous colon tissue. However, most of the data I looked through also suggests that there could be correlation, but that scientists have not yet established causation between microplastics and specific illnesses like cancer. So in essence, most of these studies are still early stage and speculative. And they use language like, it may lead, it could lead, we suspect this, the data suggests that. Essentially, very tentative and unconfirmed. The studies are also usually tested on models. I think they're referring to animals or rats here. And they often acknowledge the limitations of their studies due to the lack of data around humans and methodological issues. As you can imagine, it's very hard to measure how much microplastic we have in our bodies, let alone draw connections between that and the illnesses that could arise as a result. Now, what this means for us is that for at least the near future, we're not going to know exactly what types of diseases or cancers microplastics could cause. But what we do know is that the initial data doesn't look good, and it therefore makes sense to take action now. But let's take a step back for a moment and just consider the general cultural issues we know to be true around health and microplastics. Now, one of the things I've discovered is that chronic disease and cancer illness rates of modern, developed societies is quite odd and unnatural. Now, the logic says that the richer you are, the healthier you should be, and the longer you should live. But that's not happening in developed societies. But why? Well, this is due to a variety of factors: stress, poor diet, lack of exercise, and microplastics, to name a few. The trouble is that while we all know these factors contribute to illness, nobody can put a number on it and draw a clear connection between them and the illness you're getting. And that makes it very difficult for people to muster the motivation to make changes. Now, for food, you can draw some connection. For example, if you eat oily food, your chance of cholesterol increases, which leads to a higher risk of heart attack and stroke. You have an action and its corresponding consequence, and therefore you can conclude causation. But if you consume more microplastics, what is the impact? Nobody knows for sure. It isn't clear. But does that mean we should be ignoring it? No, of course not. Now, this tells us two things about our culture. One, we are results focused. If you want me to change a habit, you need to tell me why and even show me the proof. But there isn't any proof for microplastics yet. And our consumption of plastics happens over decades. So nobody, not even scientific experiments, can accurately pinpoint or quantify the damage clearly. This is why we need to shift from an outcome and results-focused approach to a principle-based, or what they call a Kantian approach. Now, Kantian ethics focuses on following a principle regardless of the result. So for example, I might choose not to lie even if it might cause me great pain or trouble. But this is very, very hard for us moderns. It's a bit like delayed gratification, but worse, it's more like no gratification. Right? Unless you consider not getting cancer 30 years later sufficient motivation to avoid microplastics today, I mean, I consider that quite compelling, but most people wouldn't think so. So essentially, there's not going to be any near-term reward for taking microplastics seriously. So that's the first insight. We are highly results-focused and we need to shift to a principle-based Kantian approach, even if there are no visible results. How are we supposed to do that? Well, that's a whole other topic about personal motivation and choosing to do what is difficult, which I will cover in other videos. But for now, let me move on. Now, imagine with me if there was an imaginary tracker that automatically counts how many pieces of microplastics we ingest over our lifetime. Sort of like a smart watch we wear that tracks how many steps we walk each day. And let's say once you ingest 10 million fragments of microplastics, you'll be hit with cancer. This, of course, is not true, but follow me for a little bit. Now imagine that as we go about life, we can see this number of microplastics in our body rising and rising, getting closer to the 10 million mark. But then we meet someone whose number is far lower. Everyone in their 40s and 50s are at maybe 8 or 9 million, getting very close to 10 million. But this guy in his 60s is only at 3 million. What on earth? How did he do that? Now, would he be an instant celebrity? Would he be invited to give talks and explain how he maintains such a low number? Would he be someone to imitate and copy? Now, in a sense, that is the actual world we live in, except that we can't track our microplastic consumption and we haven't confirmed that it directly causes cancer. Another way to think of it is this. Today, microplastics research is new and emerging. But maybe in 5 years' time, the consensus around the dangers of microplastics becomes clearer, and governments have laid down anti-microplastic laws and completely reconfigured cultural norms. When people eat out, if you ask for a plastic container, you are charged $10, not 20 cents. At Starbucks, you see everyone with their own stainless steel containers and stainless steel straws waiting in the queue. At food courts, all the utensils are now ceramic or porcelain, and if you break it, there's a Pay Now QR code where you pay $10 per bowl as compensation. Maybe the Public Utilities Board here in Singapore has spent $20 billion to upgrade our water filtration system such that tap water is now microplastic free. And clothing sporting brands like Lululemon or Decathlon have to abide by new laws that dictate the maximum percentage of polyester allowed in their clothing. Now imagine with me that we live in such a society in 5 or 10 years' time. And when someone brings a plastic container of food to a potluck gathering, everyone looks at them and starts gossiping about what a bad host this person is, bloody ignorant of our cultural norms. And at the end of the dinner, when everyone is clearing up their empty containers, the plastic container sits there full of food, untouched and contaminated. Now, wouldn't that be a wonderful world to live in? Well, it's actually very possible and may happen in the next few years or so. Just think back to similar changes that we've made as a society from the past, when something that was once assumed to be normal is completely phased out today and frowned upon. So for example, leaded gasoline and leaded-based paints. Up until the early 1970s, leaded gasoline was the norm in Singapore, and few questioned its health impact. But by 1998, Singapore fully phased out leaded petrol, and lead paint was progressively restricted once evidence showed its dangers to children's cognitive development. Something once invisible in daily life, the fine particles from petrol fumes, lead dust from walls, these were recognized as harmful and eventually led to outright bans. Or think of cigarette smoking in the 1960s to 70s. doctors were still debating on the scale of harm, and smoking was advertised openly. It was normal to smoke indoors, even on buses. But today, smoking is heavily taxed. And if you want to smoke in Singapore, you need to go to a yellow box corner on the side of the street, almost to remind you that you belong in jail and society doesn't want your second-hand cigarette smoke. Each time you take a stick out of your box of cigarettes, you see on the label deformed and mutilated lung tissues from patients of lung cancer. The societal messaging towards cigarettes is crystal clear. Now, in a similar way, the same can, and in my view, will happen for microplastics too. Today, coffee cups, straws, takeaway boxes, and receipts feel as normal to us as lead or cigarette use back in the past. But now that we know that harm, it's a matter of time before society catches up, and these may very well be phased out or frowned upon soon enough. And so I invite you to join me in being rigorous in wiping out microplastics from our lives. Compared to contemporary culture, we are ahead of our time and therefore pioneers in this space. Culture will only change when people realize that weirdos like us are actually living in a way that actually makes sense. And that will force others to rethink their life choices and their use of plastic. But in the meantime, the struggle is real, and my wife is a very good example of this. So she likes to buy coconut water for our children, and the one that the local supermarket sells has a little plastic mechanism where you push it down and it creates a little hole in the coconut, and then you insert a plastic straw and then you drink. And so our daughter was sick the other day, and my wife told me to go get some coconut water from the supermarket because our daughter obviously prefers sweet coconut water over plain water. But I immediately felt uncomfortable. I understood her, but I didn't want to make things difficult. But after walking around the supermarket with my daughter for a few minutes, I didn't buy it. I just went home and gave her water. Still, I found it difficult. It's pretty much the same when it comes to trying to eat plant-based foods in a meat-obsessed society. People default to what they enjoy and what is convenient. So I understand the struggle, even if it doesn't make sense. But what helped me was that during lunch with my relatives a couple of weeks ago, there was an elderly man from Seattle in his 70s who saw the same coconut drink from the supermarket sitting on the dining table. And guess what he did? He took one look at it and said, "No, I won't have that. That has plastic." And suddenly I realized in my lonely world of anti-microplastics, I finally have a friend. I can't describe to you how encouraged and inspired I was by that one act by an elderly man who lives halfway across the world. There's finally someone who is sane in this crazy world where people couldn't care less about microplastics and prefer to feed themselves cancer. So may I encourage you too to share with others about microplastics. Find friends who think similarly, and one step at a time, let's change our culture by making simple countercultural decisions that are actually good for our bodies. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.